Pastor Ron Weber. Count it an honor and a privilege to be here to share with you what God's put on our heart. And today we're going to be picking up in Genesis of pressure. Okay? Now, Genesis 26 is the only chapter in the Bible focused entirely on Isaac. It reveals how God carries his covenant promise from Abraham to the next generation, showing that God stays faithful even when we face challenges. That God stays faithful even when we face challenges. Okay? So the first thought we're going to continue with is in Genesis chapter 26, verses 1 through 23. And it says, "Now there was a famine in the land, besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. Isaac went to Gerar, to Amalek, king of the Philistines. And the Lord appeared to him and said, 'Do not go down to Egypt. Dwell in the land of which I shall tell you. So journey in this land, and I will be with you and will bless you.'" Okay? So this first thought is called faith tested by famine. Okay? Now, when we're in a famine or we're desperate for things to go wrong, sometimes we get tempted to do things we shouldn't do. Okay? Now, the first thought here I want to share under this first thought is faith tested by famine is the temptation to flee. Okay? Famines was a major threat to survival. Isaac's natural instinct was to flee to Egypt, just like his father Abraham did during earlier famine. But we found out that even though he's going by his instincts, God warned him and said, "No, you need to go to a land that I showed you." Now, our first thing when problems come is to flee and run or try to take care of things ourselves. We got to learn that we can't flee to places without God showing us where to go, because God knows the middle, the beginning, and the end of our life. So we need to learn to flee to him. We need to flee to him. Now, Pastor Ron, what do you mean we need to learn to flee to him? Well, what I mean is this. If he knows every area of our lives, if he knows everything that's going on in our lives, who do you want to flee to? A friend that only knows this much of you? Where God knows everything of you. And he already has a plan, because what's going on in your life didn't take him by surprise. It might have took us by surprise, but it didn't take him by surprise. Now, so we got to learn to run and flee to him, okay? Now, the second thought is God directs the intervention, okay? God stopped Isaac and gave him this specific geographic boundary. Blessings is tied to obedience, not to economic conditions of this land, okay? So what does this mean? Well, this means that when we flee to God, since he knows everything that we need to do in this situation, when we flee to God, we're going to find out that he's going to put some restrictions on us, because he wants to make sure you don't get into trouble. Because when we go and try to fix things on our own, we have to learn to let him intervene. We got to learn to let him take control. We got to learn to let him have that control and do what he listens and flee to him. Okay? Now, the third thought under this first thought is the covenant is confirmed in this Bible study. Okay? God repeats the exact promise made to Abraham. Land descendants and global blessing, showing that the covenant is secure. For the ones that are coming in late, we're talking about Genesis chapter 26, and we're talking about the famine that happened in the land of Canaan And he wanted to flee like his dad to Egypt, but God told him to go to another thing. And that's what we're talking about in this first thought, which is the first thought is faith tested by our family. Okay. But we get famines in our life. It might not be a food famine, but sometimes God allows testing in us to see what we would do. And what we got to do is flee to him, run to him, God, let him establish the boundaries, and let the covenant be returned of the promises that he promised you. Okay. Now, this covenant is the covenant being restored to, since Abraham is dead now, and Isaac is the one that carry on the promise of getting the promised land. He is being instructed now that God is confirming the covenant with Isaac. Okay. Now, I got a reflecting question for you. When you experience an emotional, financial famine, do you look for a quick human escape, or do you wait for God's direction? Let me tell you something, saints. I had to learn that yesterday. I've been so frustrated with something going on in my life, which I can't tell you about, that I went to God yesterday and I said, Lord, this, and this is happening, and I need to know what to do about it. And he gave me a vision of a white thing coming in the bottom of it, and it started putting out the fire. And he spoke to me and he said, hey, this means that you're in the fire right now. You're in conflict right now. But it means that you're with God at the ground level of it. It means God is rooted in it. You have God in it. So that means that God is going to bring you through. You need to trust him. Trust me. That's what God told me. So that's what we got to do. Instead of trying to fix it ourselves, we need to wait and run into his so he can help us. Now, the second thing that Genesis 26 teaches us, let's go to Genesis chapter 26, not 2, verses 7 through 9. When the men of the place asked him about his wife, he said, she is my sister. For he feared to say, my wife, thinking, lest the men of the place should kill me because of Rebekah, because she was attractive in appearance. So Abimelech called Isaac and said, behold, she is your wife. How then could you say she is my sister? Okay. So this one is called fear and the old nature. And the reason I said the old nature, because Abraham had this problem too, didn't he? He was afraid that someone would kill him. But the thing is, it really was his sister. Okay? But here, this ain't his sister. It's part of his family, but it's not a sister. Okay? It's his wife. So the study point of this thought, generational sin. Isaac repeated exactly the lie his father Abraham told decades earlier. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 20. Fear can make us default to old dysfunctional habits. That's why we got to run to God first. Because we don't want to go back to the old thing. Because if we go that, it's going to cause us to rely on things that we did before that we shouldn't have did in the first place. We got to learn to rely on God. 2, the irony of exposure. Okay? A pagan king, Abimelech, discovered the truth and rebuked the chosen man of God for his love and integrity. So in other words, we got to watch what we do because people are watching us, especially if you're in ministry or you're a pastor or you're a Sunday school teacher or you do something for the church. People are watching you if they know that. If you're a Christian, people are watching you. We got to make sure we live a life considering this Bible. Now, we're going to make mistakes. We're not perfect. Okay? Now, We're only human. But if we learn to trust God, we're going to have that integrity. In other words, if they see you acting and cheating and lying and stuff like that, you're going to hurt your witness for God and your witness of serving God. And you're sinning against God. We got to learn to be who we are and trust that God's going to take care of us if we're in a dangerous situation. Okay. And the last thought on this, God's sovereignty protects you. Okay. Despite Isaac's failure and cowardness, God protected Rebekah and Isaac from harm, providing his grace outweighed human weakness. In other words, God protected them. And God will still protect you when we sin and you ask God to forgive you. He will protect you and he will bring you through, even though we don't think we deserve it. Reflect question for this. What generational pattern or fear-based habit you need to break and help from God? Do you have something you learned from your dad and mom when in crisis that you need to break and trust in God? And if you're visualizing that right now, you need today, sometime today, go to God and ask him to break you from that generational habit that causes problems. Okay? Now, let's go to the third thought of this Bible study. And turn to, well, we're still in Genesis 26, and we're going to look at verses 12 to 15. Okay? 12, 14 through 15. Okay? And Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. The Lord blessed him, and the man became rich. He had possessions of flocks and herds and many servants, so that the Philistines envied him. Now the Philistines had stopped and filled in the earth of all the wells that his father had dug. Okay? What is this one called? Prosperity and conflict. Now, you're going to get this as a Christian. If you're doing something for God and you're being blessed, people are going to get jealous. And the sad thing is, sometimes the jealousy comes from other Christians. But you're not supposed to focus on that. You got to focus on what God called you to do. So the study point of this particular chapter, of these particular verses, is 1, supernatural increase. Okay? Isaac reaped 100-fold return during the famine. This is a direct result of God blessing him, not perfect weather or farming techniques. In other words, Isaac was living for God right now. He was doing everything he was supposed to do, and God blessed him. Okay? The cost of the blessing, though, even though we shouldn't lose the cost from blessing, is great blessings often provoked envy in the world. The Philistines tried to sabotage Isaac by stopping his water sources. In other words, they were so jealous that they tried to stop him and try to kill his herd so he wouldn't be as successful. But, maybe instead of being envy, maybe instead of being vengeful, maybe we should look and see what they're doing and try doing that. In other words, getting right with our God and start living for God. Okay? Now, the last thought on this heading is this. Yielding for peace. Instead of fighting for his rights, Isaac continued to move and dig new wells. Iski, Nixia, and finally, Rehoboth. He trusted God to defend him. In other words, when people are going against you or trying to hurt you for your faith or for life, fighting and getting even ain't back. Ain't the thing. We got to learn to trust God. We got to learn to let him take care of us and not worry and try to get people back. A lot of people says, well, They got me. Now I got to get. That ain't the way it works, brethren and sister in the Lord. We got to be who we are. Because again, it goes back to our witness. Because if someone hurts you and reflects, it's going to show you as a bitter Christian, and they say, well, he's no better than I am. I can do the same thing he did. Why should I get saved? Think about it. And the other thing is, you're lowering yourself and not trusting God. And you're making a bigger mess for God to clean up. Okay. So let's look at the fourth thought now, which is 24 through 25 and verse 28. And it says of Genesis chapter 26, and the Lord appeared to him that same night and said, I am the God of Abraham, the father, your father. Fear not, for I am with you. So he built an altar there and called upon the name of the Lord. Then Admelech and his men said, we see plainly that the Lord has been with you. Okay? So this thought is worship and public testimonies. That's what this next section of this verse deals with. The first thought under this heading, renewing assurance. Okay? Once Isaac settled in Bathsheba, God appeared to him again to comfort his fears and remind him of the promise. In other words, hey, this is your land. We're going to bless you. Just trust me. And then the promise will come to pass. Okay? Now, the second thought is the response of worship. Isaac built an altar, pitched his tent, and dug a well. Worshiping God and securing his household could come before his work. In other words, before he did his work, before he did anything, first thing he did is build an altar and worship God. Then he built his tent for his family and him. He dug a well to live there, and then he started his work of feeding his flock and sharing them and whatever, killing them or selling them, whatever he does. Okay? That's what we need to do. Everything we do, we need to put God first. Okay? Now, a witness to the nation. The last thought of this. Isaac peacefully spirit and opposition, blessing, compelled his former enemies to come and ask for a peace treaty. They recognized God's hand on him. In other words, he decided to have peace, try to make peace with these people. And the nation saw it, and they were willing to make peace. Reflection question. Does your life bear enough distinct evidence of God's blessing and peace that non-believers notice it? In other words, does the people around you see God in your life? That's basically what this is saying. What can we take away from Genesis 26? 1, location matters. Stay exactly where God tells you to stay, even if the circumstances look difficult. Grace. Number 2, grace beats failure. God says committing to his promise, even when he stumbled into fear and deception. Okay? 3, dig another well. When people oppose you, move forward in faith. God will eventually give you the room to flourish. Okay? Reviewing this chapter to understand how God builds endurance in his people through everyday trials. Here are a few ways we can explore this topic further to help when you study preparations for personal devotion. 1, we can outline a sermon manuscript, printable discussion guide, or historical contents. That's how you can find more about this. Okay. So I thank you for joining me. And let's go. And I know the with me right now, but I like to go and see. Okay, I like to say hi. I don't know what OOA is. I like to say hi to that person. I am from Michigan in the United States, and I answered all the questions. But on that note, I like to say God bless you. Have a blessed day. I'm Pastor Ron for God's Internet Church, walking with God day by day. Have a blessed day, and God bless you.